several books, including philosophical essays. She focuses on contemporary philosophy, particularly ethics. At this conference, we challenged her to speak about thinking change and enacting change, and thinking is not enough. We need to act. I give you Marcia Tiburi.
Bom dia a todas e todos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the organization for the invitation to speak on the topic Thinking Change, Enacting Change, Culture's Role in Tackling Social Transformation. The aim of which is to provide input to the discussion on peripheries. The periphery is the historical and epistemological novelty that launches new ways to think about transformation of societies in a global scenario. My reflection takes into account the role of culture that comes from these places called peripheries, and that questions citizens who come from the so-called central places. To do this, it is necessary to analyze the conditions of possibility in which we call culture in general, and what we call culture of the periphery, as well as the field that opens up from there, namely the place of a non-periphery. The invitation is to reflect about transformation and to set in motion the action of transformation. However, to transform is not a verb without an object. One who transforms something. So we need to understand what is to transform and what we must transform. What we are aiming at is an utopia that has no face, precisely because it will take on the face of each person who wishes to invent it. The purpose of my speech is, furthermore, to think about the nexus between theory and practice that could be summarized in the following words. It is necessary to know if we want to transform. I know that I'm talking to artists and cultural agents. I know that this audience can discuss what we call dissociated consciousness or awareness. That is, the declarative awareness made up of discourse about the arts in the field of culture that, however, do not seek transformation. Now, we must build culture to overcome this dissociated consciousness and to transform the world, which implies transforming subjectivities, relations, and actions. This is why developing the relationship with education and with projects involving intersectionality with the field of communication is so important today. The moral and cognitive principle that governs my speech is openness to the other. To transform the world is to transform the way we relate to the other. From this, another ethics and another aesthetics and another policy arises. A well-known European anthropologist said that one characteristic of Brazilian Indians is openness to the other. He still used in his famous book Tristes Trópicos the word Indian. I think that it is possible to propose that openness to the other is the ethical, aesthetic, political principle that we seek, of the transformation that we seek. This is what we can propose within the framework of a politics of friendship. we must take or address periphery as a logical and epistemological operator, all the while ethical, aesthetic, and political operator capable of opening multiple paths in our experience. Seeking a dialogue with you, I will organize my speech as a movement. First, I will reflect on the concept of periphery and culture, articulating them with the concept of coloniality. I seek to answer the question, how have the cultural practices of periphery transformed the very sense of periphery and create worlds beyond peripherality? Then I will look at the notion of world and the concept of transformation. I want to answer the question, what world do we wish to transform? Finally, I launch the idea of policies of friendship, which imply policies of listening and dialogue. In this context, the very concept of democracy undergoes an urgent and necessary alchemy. The scenario of degeneration of democracies into fascist demagogies all over the world can be dismantled in the name of a world of well-being, a concept I bring from the indigenous peoples of the Andes and of the territory where I myself come from. In fact, reflecting on the ways of thinking and doing of the so-called peripheral universe is something essential. To understand the relationship between culture and the periphery, to think of the culture of the periphery is to realize that every culture is situated in space and time. The idea of periphery implies the notion of center, the center periphery being an axis that has been part of capitalist epistemology for a long time, at least since the emergence of the so-called European modernity between the 15th and 16th centuries. The capitalism that emerges at that time implies colonization as action, but also colonialism as ideology born with the invasion of the territory. Coloniality as structure and symbolic production crowns all this, and it is this that establishes the concept of periphery, always produced and reproduced in power structures. Thus, the territory is colonized by Europe and recolonized by the current internal colonizers, they being oligarchs, patriarchal and capitalist, were the first peripheries. I start by raising this question because it is important to build familiarity in Europe with the historical process by which the inhabitants of the territory colonized under the name of the America decided to find another name for their place. Today, indigenous peoples who were heterodenominated Indians and indigenous in acts of inaugural epistemological violence start using the term Abya to refer to their territory. Abya means land in all its maturity or land of life blood. The term becomes the poetic, political. It is the poetic political response to the epistemological violence that destroyed the culture of these peoples. The violence was symbolic, but also physical, material, and economic. The long process of resistance is cultural, and resistance is also a cultural factor and cultural production. In this context, self-denomination is an action of confrontation against the imposed heterodenomination. It is a fundamental linguistic and cultural act. It has the power to recreate a world or to create another world. Abya is a proposition of self-identity against the imposition of a forced identity. I raise this aspect anticipating what is at stake in this text. It is necessary to know in order to transform, and every practical transformation is at the same time a symbolic transformation. That is a transformation that goes through language. In this case, what is at stake are the words that say things or that hide things, as the Bolivian philosopher Silvia Kusikanki says. The peoples to whom I refer are the Incas, Mayas, Aymara, and Quechua, but also the peoples who live in Brazil. They lived and endured an epistemological war, that is, a war of cultural conquest. The response to this war was an act of linguistic freedom. Therefore, the name Abya is more than an act of resignification. It is a symbolic intervention that allows them to redesign and rewrite the history of this territory. It is about rewriting the history of time, of a place, about returning the present time to this place. In a profound sense, the symbolic intervention has the function of restoring meaning and restoring historical time to the oppressed and to the descendants of the victims of colonization. Allow me to now raise one more aspect that clearly exposes the transforming and restoring cultured linguistic gesture. In Brazil, people classified within the signifier of indigenous peoples have realized the revolutionary nature of naming in the process of the cultural resurrection. In 2016, the writer Daniel Manduruku made an important statement before a huge audience. He said, "I am not an Indian." He claimed that there are no Indians in Brazil, and he explained to the people that he was not an Indian, but Munduruku. The self-affirmation surprised these people. Certainly, understanding the violence implicit in the act of heterodenomination practiced at the advent of Christopher Columbus's arrival in Kanahani in 1492 frees us from the surprise. I do not want to tire you with the story of the invasion of these territories, although there are still people in Europe who inappropriately call this the discovery to refer to this moment. The opposition discovery invasion is revealing. While discovery covers up violence, invasion exposes it. The world we want to transform is the world that covers up violence. The sense of culture that we seek today implies emancipation from this context of concealment. We aim at the historical truth, and this implies hermeneutic respect and responsibility. I will return to the theme of transformation, but for now I want to dedicate myself a little more to the topic of periphery. In a way, our use today of the word periphery has the same meaning. Initially, periphery was used in the negative sense. However, periphery was appropriated by the so-called peripheral people. Today, the subjects of the periphery call themselves peripherals. Other characters have been doing the same for some time, such as women and feminists who have learned to use the heterodenominations positively about their lives. Similarly, people who have been heterodenominated as Negroes or blacks have appropriated the negative labeling, turned it into positive one, relativized the absolutizations, thus debunking a codification of power. The dogmas inherent in the labeling were neutralized in order to soften or even lose their power over the victims of this epistemological violence, which we intend to change through our cultural actions. Therefore, we are facing a movement of profound transformation, and an important aspect of this process is the anthropophagic appropriation of these concepts. Notice that I'm talking of anthropophagic and not cannibalistic, and this implies an important symbolic transformation. Allow me to dwell a little on this concept, the concept of anthropophagia. Perhaps some of you know the Brazilian thinker Oswald de Andrade, who coined the notion of anthropophagy in the first half of the 20th century in Brazil. Anthropophagy refers to the devouring of foreign concepts and ideas. This symbolic devouring implies a transformation of the subject of the action. The object of anthropophagy modifies the subject. If we analyze the concept of periphery today, we can say that it has been taken over anthropophagically by the heterodenominated peripheral subjects. They have eaten their enemies through gestures, sorcery, spells, the evil eye that were cast upon their bodies in historical process. Just as Daniel Mondokuro is no longer Indian, just as America has become Abya Yala, today's periphery is no longer the periphery of capitalist heterodenomination, but is currently anthropophagy and anthropophagic banquet. In my view, the word periphery will no longer be used. The concept we are working with is therefore temporary, as are the things we eat. Devouring the enemy's words and deeds is a way of anthropophagizing the enemy and thus freeing oneself from him. And this is a cultural and symbolic process that is very powerful. Great transformations are underway in Brazil and Latin America, or what we today call Abya Yala, in spite of what we define as white, racist, and oligarchic coup. The indigenous people are becoming part of life of the National Congress. In Africa, we already speak of Afropolitanism as Akile Mbembe does, signaling other geopolitics. Therefore, it's not difficult to see that the notion of center periphery has already been overtaken by the notion of periphery as its own center. The periphery has become a center unto itself. Today, we can speak of peripherality as a space of production of awareness and transformation of the position of the periphery as responsible self-centeredness. If the notion of, while the notion or concept of peripherality is provisional, soon we will start using more poetic names to define the world that is left from the current neoliberal destruction that seeks to reach its apotheosis. I speak of destruction not to cause fear in you, but to alert you to the urgency of halting the advancement of neoliberalism as the economy of fascist politics. The cultural efforts of the moment are the efforts to prevent fascism from advancing. Time is pressing. I remind you of an indigenous chief called Yuruna asking before the white people, if our people have been destroyed, why do you think you will survive? In this sense, a question erupts from history, bringing another huge problem. Can culture point to the urgent preservation of nature and thus also of culture creating human life on planet Earth? Indeed, no reflection about culture today can forget the topic of nature and the destiny to which the cultural project of capitalism has thrown us. What general culture project and what specific projects can we offer to confront capitalism? I raise such questions assuming that European inhabitants and citizens, either central or peripheral, can benefit from them as well. If inhabitants from non-European places have been placed in inferior positions and have suffered and continue to suffer territorial, xenophobic and racist prejudice, while they have been marked by the ideas and words of others in authoritarian manners, if their ancestors were raped and killed and yet they have survived, this was not by chance but by the work of creating culture. Today, what these peoples do is to rise from the rubble of violence and silencing and repropose the survival of their own culture, the reinvention of culture, and thus the transformation of their own lives as a whole. The rebirth under adverse conditions is exactly what the territories called periphery have done so far. Where there should be no art, where there should be no beauty, where there should be no economy and politics, no freedom and autonomy, it is precisely there that in these places that culture has moved such people to emancipation. These are acts of boldness because to do art or to make art, just as to make politics, is an act of is a bold act, and even more so an act of freedom. And it is this act of freedom, a theft in turn operated by liberalism and neoliberalism. It is this act of freedom that we are seeking. I would like to propose a concluding reflection on this topic. The binomial center-periphery is part of the logic of the measure that constitutes coloniality as a profound process of production of values such as superior, inferior, black, white, man, woman, heterosexual, homosexual, etc. The term center-periphery is part of the binary pattern of the devouring and cannibalistic logic of capitalism, to which we can oppose the anthropophagic aesthetic logic I mentioned earlier. To this devouring logic we can give the name patriarch capitalism. That is the system that creates a cognitivism that is a mentality and an effectivity, and that also creates an activism that is a pattern of action, of practices that repeat the old ideology of utilitarianism. I am referring to activism related to production and reproduction, and not only of labor, but also of culture as a whole. That is, we are facing a pattern of thought and affection, as well as behavior that is characterized by repetition. But not only, it is characterized by serial reproductivity, the reproducibility of thought and action, which means that human beings will copy the pattern of machines. For this, subjectivities need to be reproduced industrially. This is what capitalism expects of bodies. It adulates while it sucks out of them the spirit. This cannibal devouring of the spirit by capitalism means the cultural industry with its mechanisms of emptying and filling subjectivities. One must highlight that the sense of culture that we seek is opposed to all of this. It seeks cultural meanings and practices that liberates, that frees up subjectivity, that helps us save our imagination and allows us to construct life as a work of art. In this sense, consumerism has taken the place of cultural activities, constituting itself a form of activism through which the slave collaborates in the enslavement process by rebotizing itself. The human body mimics. I come from a country that has one of the highest amounts of consumption of internet and social media worldwide. The human body mimics machines by copying their function. In the same way, what we are calling fascism today, namely the manipulation of the masses in the direction of authoritarianism, comes from the language game implanted in culture as the consumerism of language itself, a kind of consumerism through the compulsion to repeat the linguistic cliché of hatred and the religion of capitalism. Now, capitalism, just as fascism, requires that each individual surrender to his or her tormentor, as if they were being free to do so. In the same way, we can say that coloniality generated by capitalism functions on the basis of humiliation as the political technology of power. For it is the culture of humiliation associated with the culture of rape and harassment that we can and must replace with the culture of dialogue. This culture of dialogue, in turn, can have its paths opened by intersectional cultural projects involving art education to be promoted on a global scale. Certainly, we can work on projects for our communities, but it would be important that such projects do not erase the universal character of today's particular challenges. Transformation is an action that requires the concept of dialectics of processes involving individuals and groups, and the manipulation of the masses desired by the neoliberal fascist project. Considering the preservation of the economy by neoliberalism and the perversion of politics by fascism, we can understand the process of transformation as an ethical, aesthetic, political alchemy. This ethical, aesthetic, political alchemy is a method by which one moves from a state of putrefaction to a state of excellence. I am talking about ways to overcome the state of sadness, of cognitive and moral humiliation, of material and spiritual poverty to a state of well-being and good living, when we become once again with the territory in which we live beyond the uprooting to which we are thrown in the condition of urban slaves at the service of capital. It is not a matter, therefore, of continuing to resist and survive in the context of neoliberal. It is a matter of overcoming this theological political economy towards another model of economy. And this goes through culture. I now come to my conclusion. I speak as an individual from the South to involuntarily live in France, in Europe. Today I live in France as an exile, and I write this remembering coloniality and how this perception in history is very important to all of us. The Europe I live in is, for me, a space of margin. It is a kind of concentration camp. Concentration camp. My country, in turn, is a extermination camp. So it is to my advantage to live here. At least I live. Different of Marielle Frank, defender of human rights, who was killed by exterminating groups. These groups, extermination groups, these are extermination groups. Perhaps you might find this a bit exaggerated, but it is the case. They arrived at power through a game, by manipulating masses that sustain this political game. If you listen to news in Brazil, you understand that there are masses of people who are requesting federal intervention and the return of dictatorship, who are in delirium, true mass hysteria. And this was culturally produced through psychological war. That is part of the cultural war that is practiced by neoliberalism and through its symbolic arm of fascism. Unfortunately, we also find this in several countries of Europe, including in Portugal. And I say this because I believe that it is important to speak to you about the fundamental character, the fundamental nature of exile, immigration, and foreign population in Europe. So my purpose is to put before your eyes the foreigner and at the center of our discourse, so that we change our habits. As an isolated foreigner demanding exile, I feel urged to open my eyes and ears to a new policy of opening. Considering that European cultures are being destroyed by neoliberal politics, we need to help populations to reconquer their territories in order to not be submitted to all this foreign condition. By the way, the exile is becoming more and more common in the scenario of the destruction of democracies, and it is a very rich topic because it allows us to reflect upon its diversity in the capitalist area. Thus, exile is also the feeling of those who feel displaced in the world. The exile is always the periphery. So I propose that we think about this ethical, aesthetical, political alchemy as a method of reflection, including this perspective of policies of listening. And I'm trying to summarize, says the speaker, to leave more time for your questions. So now I'll move directly to my paragraphs on the policies of listening. I have defended culture of dialogue focusing on differences. This is being prevented in the current world. The policies of friendship are precisely those of policies of acceptance and of repair, and not of imposition. They are policies of openness to the other, policies of listening, and not policies centered on speech. They are ecological policies that focus on the process of care and of welcoming coming from trends, popular feminisms that advance in Bolivia and other territories of Abiole. In this line, I suggest that we reflect on the politics of friendship as a theoretical and empirical project, poetic conceptual experiments in the form of dialogic laboratories from the transdisciplinary performative experiments. We need to develop philosophical, social, and artistic and pedagogical methodologies that can collaborate with subjects and institutions that aim to build and organically and micrologically densify a democratic society. Ideas of recognition of the other and of otherness, capable of producing present and future forms of coexistence, because it is precisely conviviality between human beings and nations and perspectives that are at stake in this project. The production of an intensely democratic imagery emerges as a conceptual, epistemological and ethical political operator, as productive and transforming character that can lead us to new social and political directions. We live on a global scale of a kind of mystic of the future, as if the future were magically contained and realized and fulfilled in the present time. This stems from the technological mentality expanding its marks into all areas of life, defining a new ontology whereby human beings become more and more robotized. The loss of the nexus with the human condition is an effect of the increasingly mystified relationship with technological apparatuses and their magical promises. We believe in hyperconnectedness, but this does not guarantee that we have reached the dimension of otherness. All over the world, from all countries, consume technological goods join the internet and participate more and more in social media, as if this world of means has become a world of ends in itself. What Kant called the realm of ends becomes more and more fragile. The idea of a universal human community depended on the exercise of reason, itself an exercise of language that we can call dialogue from the beginning of times. Dialogue is by definition the exercise of the language of difference. Another effect is the loss of the relationship with the past, especially the common past. From my perspective, the current dialogical experience must take into account this mysticism of the present and the reflection on the common past. Thus, we need to return to the search for a common past. I believe that that is what will allow us as individuals to continue to socialize, because a common past will lay the grounds for what I have called the policies of friendship and also the framework for dialogue between cultures that will help rebuild Europe and will help rebuild the violent relations that we still find in the colonialized territory. And I say this because I believe that it has not been possible to generate a dialogue between us that is a curtain, a poorly sewn surface, because we have not been able to build a pact for dialogue. And this is why we must develop policies of dialogue, which should be founded on the dialogue between governments, of course, but also between civil society engaged in cultural actions. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I am at your disposal for questions and comments.
Obrigada, Márcia.
Thank you very much, Marcia. An inspiring speech. I believe we all agree with this statement, and I'm sure that there are many questions and comments. Ricardo and myself will try to moderate this session, and we will have to keep it short, I'm afraid. I hope we have time for all your questions. I'll try to limit the debate to a maximum of 15 minutes because we are running behind schedule. I will give the floor to the audience, but before doing so, while you organize yourselves, I will raise, I will comment something, and Marcia will be certainly able to comment on this at the end of all questions. And this has to do with the idea of a space of resistance, transformation, the possibility to build another world, but at the same time you say it is an instrument to empty subjectiveness, an instrument of manipulation at the service of capitalism. But in that case, we as agents of culture, we are part of that system because we are financed by institutions that are financed by that system. How can we prevent the replication of this colonialization of this situation? How can we promote listening and dialogue in order to achieve transformation? And now over to the audience.
Thank you for your speech. I'm Bojan from Novi Sad, from Serbia. I have some comment more than question, because when we speak about peripheries, we speak more from this geographical and geostrategical perspective, from race perspective. But there is also peripheries inside national borders and societies, on a border of class and gender also. So I think it's also important to speak about peripheries inside the national societies. Also about fascism, I think this is also a lot of works about that fascism, it's a product of colonialism, it's a way of colonialism in Europe. So when we speak and force the fascism, it's some kind of, for me, Eurocentric perspective about the atrocities, because the colonialism, in the history of centuries of colonialism, there is more atrocities than maybe in Second World War. But to speak about fascism, it's when we want to mark some evil, it's a Eurocentric perspective, I think, still in discourse of defining the things. So I think it's better to speak about colonialism and fascism. It's a product of this thing. About the culture, we are speaking in most cases as a culture as a general term, but there is a cultures, not culture, and it's always important to speak about what culture we are speaking, because there is a different culture by gender, by class, by race, by nation, by local or other things. So I think it's important to speak about something specific, and who is what kind of culture, what part of society is presenting this culture. About the change, about the dialogue, and what is the tools for changing the things. I think the huge paradox is that people who are, let's say, educated and right-wings are very politically proactive, and go in political party, go in voting, and have the power. And the intellectual society, somehow it's politically passive. Even they have more knowledge and understanding of things, somehow it's politically passive, and always want to change something from non-formal political action and so on. But we see that it's not working for years and decades, and still we are promoting this. I asked on the last one debate the French theoretic about why we don't have feminist political parties, because before 100 years a lot of women died to give the women the vote, and today we don't do anything with this. This is the question: why we don't have feminist party in the world to fight really through political institution, not only non-formal, because politics are power. So I think that's it. It's enough.
Thank you. That's all, gang.
Any other question? I have a question. I don't know whether I would rather wait, and I mean, if we have the time, I will put my question. Okay, please go ahead and ask your question. I'm also from Brazil, and regarding what you said, Marcia, about the process on people that are there, the collective hysteria, you draw my attention to something, which is the fact that people are there, they are mobilized, and in fact they are involved. And there is an interesting situation. Some time back, I think it was before the election of Bolsonaro, there was a lady in my building. She was a very humble person, and one day she was dressing green and yellow, and she was very thrilled because she was actually participating in something. So my question is, what is it that you can say about this? These people in some way were thirsty for some involvement and for a policy of friendship and a more encompassing culture, and all the social environment is not there, but what we have there is this arm of fascism. This is what I had to say. Maybe just one more question, and then we'll give the floor to Marcia to answer. Good morning. Thank you very much, Marcia. I have a question. I would like to ask you, how can you, in fact, promote this openness to others in a bilateral manner? I heard, this idea of peripheral subjects as anthropophagic is a beautiful one, but peripheries are heterogenic, and the said peripheral subjects continue to live aside political and economic decisions that define their lives. And I question myself, how can we establish this opening to the other in a manner that is more fair? I mean, to which extent aren't we speaking of subjects such as ourselves that are opening up to others? And I mean, we are the ones that are here in this room, and we're speaking about the other. Well, thank you. I'll try to answer to all the questions. I'll try to answer to what they have in common. A first issue was, what is the concept of culture I'm working with? Well, I believe that today we can say that culture is something that is not separated from politics. When we do culture, what we do is to do something towards the other, in favor of the other, together with the other person or against that other person. Along these lines, I wrote a book I wrote a book called Practical Philosophy. This was a book in which I spoke about ethics, day-to-day life, and virtual life, because today we also live a virtual day-to-day life. This is another area of our experience. So what we do with others and with is culture, and what we do with each other, that is politics. And we have politics as ontology, what actually makes us, and that is closer to the concept of culture. And we have politics such as bureaucracy, organization, that kind of thing. Policy and politics, these are the two things that are at stake as far as we're concerned. Now, when we do culture, we produce subjectivity. Culture is to produce subjectivity. As artists, as cultural agents, as writers, we can include teachers and educators and communicators in this, because the whole process of culture is a process of production, of producing language. We are always producing language, and we hold control on the means of language production. We create those means to produce language that are captured by neoliberals. I'm very much concerned with social networks because they imply the creation of culture. If you pay attention to several social networks, Instagram, that's a neoliberal endeavor, we have a support for arts, for communication, and it is a software that controls what many agents can do, many agents of culture, many artists and citizens that want to participate in the world of culture. Along these lines, I consider that the question on culture as participation is very important. Culture is the production of ways to participate. The operator how in several of your experiences is very important. We listen to theories and suddenly we get this question, how? That's a very pressing question. We need to find ways that allow for the inclusion of people, and those that dress themselves with green and yellow, they feel that they are integrated by fascism in Brazil. They actually looked for a community, and that was the community that was suited for them. When I started the feminist movement in Brazil, this was the first the first feminist movement that proposed a change in the numbers of participation of women. When we created this movement of empowering people in Brazil, we called on women to occupy space. It was the principle of occupying that was at stake. To call people to occupy, to participate. And this is the principle that is used by neoliberals that own social networks, that own internet spaces, TV, cinema, all that produced a principle of participation to actually occupy space in front of the screen, you know, being part of an audience, and they actually address this longing of participating, of being together with. And I believe that we can offer this to people. I discovered this as a teacher of philosophy, and throughout my life, you know, during these last 25 years, while teaching philosophy, I decided to speak to people philosophically. I mean, to actually do philosophy together with people. And to produce dialogue is actually to make philosophy with people, is to think with people, to build reflection path together with these people. And reflective thinking is the biggest enemy of fascism. This is what Theodor said. And we, via a culture of reflection that invites to dialogue instead of imposing the reflection of this course, we can invite people to dialogue, and for that we need to listen. And how can we do that? We can create cells, performances, spaces where the main principle is being open to the other, and to produce listening policies. And in fact, to conclude, fascism colonizes colonialism was already fascism, and along these lines, Europe is being colonized. Yes, it's being colonized by fascism. All European countries. It is the same principle of the destruction of the other, the principle of cancelling, of closing to otherness. I did not have time to actually close to address this concept of living in a dignified manner, and that is what it's stake for us as well. If it is worthwhile living, it's because we are living in a full manner, and this is what we are actually trying to achieve. Thank you very much, and sorry for being so fast. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Marcia, for your very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for the questions. We need to close this session. We are very much limited by time, and I'd like to give the floor to Claudia to proceed with the next sessions. Thank you.
So I'm going to address in Portuguese because we're in Portugal, so it's nice to welcome Portuguese people.
Obrigada a todos por
Thank you very much for this first part of the day. We will now have a 20-minute break. I would like to say that the toilets are not really visible, so when you are at our welcome desk, you have a stairs, you need to go downstairs, and you actually you will get to the toilets. If you need water, fill your bottles with water. We also have a quiet room if you want to speak or to just to get access to your emails. You have a quiet room at your disposal. Before lunch, I will be introducing our production team. We all have a badge that says team,